I'm very excited to be here virtually, and I will be sending around information for some Zoom office hours for attendees of the summer school so I can interact with some of you one-on-one. I had really hoped to be there in person, but hopefully that way we can still have space to answer more detailed questions as they arise. So my goal today is really between today's tutorial and tomorrow's, it's to give you a very condensed version of the key conceptual material from the grad course on probabilistic programming that we've offered at MIT, so that you can then do the online tutorials for Gen, which are publicly available at gen.dev. I'll link to them a couple of times tomorrow. But my goal is for you to be able to do them with sort of the conceptual background to get the most out of them. So this format will be kind of, mostly we'll be going over plenty of example probabilistic programs, but we're going to be doing it mainly through slides. And I hope you can follow on by checking out the notebook, the tutorial notebooks after tomorrow. Now, I think it's worth spending a few minutes just sort of on the scope and the outline. Today, we're really going to cover bullets 1 and 2. I'm going to try to give you briefly a view on probabilistic programming and intelligent systems from MIT's perspective, an MIT view that sort of captures sort of convergent efforts from a number of faculty. And I'm going to go through 2 example probabilistic programs in Gen in some detail that I think highlight some of the distinctive features of this view. Specifically, we're going to learn how to do online learning of probabilistic program structure from structured time series, and how to do real-time inference of simple 3D scenes from real-world depth video. So that's part 1. And that'll set the stage for part 2 tomorrow, where we're going to dive a little more deeply into the computer science underneath the AI capabilities in part 1. So we're going to look at the Gen inference metaprogramming model in some detail. We're going to open up the hood of Gen a little bit. We're going to talk about fundamental limits from theory on automation and scaling for inference and the engineering prospects for automating inference. And then I'll talk a little bit about current directions, including OpenGen, which includes Python and C++ versions of Gen that are compatible with the same basic abstract data types. And I'll close with the discussion of current AI engineering research. And my hope is by the end of it, that in addition to being able to do the tutorials with a bit more conceptual preparation, some of you will be inspired to get involved in probabilistic programming and AI. And in that case, I really encourage you to reach out by email. The probabilistic programming community is growing. We're offering a new summer school next year, which I can say more about for people who are interested. A number of faculty around the world are recruiting grad students in the area, and there's work kind of both on the programming languages and AI sides of the picture. Okay, so let's dive in. But before I do that, I just want to acknowledge several students and colleagues whose work you'll be hearing about in the tutorial. So especially want to acknowledge Marco Cusimano-Towner, a former student who was the lead creator of Gen. I want to acknowledge Firas Saad, a former student, is technically still current, but he's starting on the faculty at Carnegie Mellon in 2023. And he'll also be looking for graduate students. So I'll be highlighting some of his research contributions, and the structural learning example today is drawn principally from his work. And Nishad Gathaskar, a current PhD student whose work on 3D scene perception will be diving into some detail today. And many others, current students and colleagues have contributed as well, and you'll hear about them more throughout the tutorial. Okay, so what's the view we're going to use as a starting point for probabilistic programming and intelligent systems? So at a very high level, we've been developing probabilistic programming languages not just to compute with probability distributions, which is interesting, but because we're interested in engineering and reverse engineering distinctively human facets of intelligence. In particular, we're interested in common sense. So the type of knowledge that allows people to see the world in 3 dimensions, understand physical objects and the behavior of goal-directed agents like this adult on the video here, who's doing this puzzling thing of maybe trying to put the books inside the cabinet. And the toddler correctly interprets the adult's goal, even though the adult failed to achieve it, and generates a behavior to help in response. So by common sense, I mean knowledge about people, objects, and places and how they all interact that arise in adults or arise in children over the first, say, 18 months of life. We're also very interested in data-driven expertise. So the type of knowledge that allows adults to align data on millions of children and to interpret it to try to understand the impact of policy interventions for diseases like kwashiorkor, which you see represented on the slide here, particular growth insult that is associated with severe malnutrition. And so we're interested in modeling capacities of intelligence and building intelligent systems that can help in both of these broad domains. And that leads us to a computational puzzle, which is how can intelligent systems account for the uncertainty in their models and the structure of their models that are only approximating the external world? So computer science gives us mature tools, such as simulation engines like Unity, for modeling the sense data that an agent in a simulated world might be likely to perceive or to receive through their senses, given a ground truth world state and known causal laws. But what goes on inside the intelligent system on the right, that is perceiving the external world using approximate models, accounting for uncertainty in the current structure of the world, and also accounting for uncertainty even over the structure of the laws by which the world evolves. That's much harder. So what are the computing abstractions that allow us to do that? That's the computational jumping off point for probabilistic programming that's at the heart of this tutorial. And this view that we need to build intelligent systems that can account for the uncertainty and the structure of models that approximate the world is complementary to, and in some ways in tension with, the prevailing view of intelligence as large-scale neural modeling, where we use differentiable programming technology and distributed systems to scale up end-to-end training of neural networks. Now, this view of neural networks plays a central role in probabilistic programming. You'll see it referred to repeatedly in many of the examples I present, but we see it as only one component in a larger toolkit that's needed to engineer intelligent systems. And so at the heart of our view of probabilistic programming is that it provides new formalisms drawn from programming languages for integrating symbolic, probabilistic, and neural approaches to AI engineering. So we can build models that have structure, that are generative and allow us to do inference. And we can learn not just the parameters, but in many cases also the structure of those models from data. And so the main goal of my tutorial today is to give you a couple of very concrete code level examples of what I mean by this picture. And then tomorrow, I'm going to sort of open up what's under the hood for how we actually implement those systems and the probabilistic programming infrastructure we used to implement those systems, as well as talk about scaling and other limits. But I think it's useful just to spend a moment reflecting on sort of where the field is and where we have to go. So I'd say this is an interesting moment for probabilistic programming and AI because really only in the last couple of years, we now have multiple application domains, 3D scene perception, data cleaning, including deduplication and linkage of databases with millions of records, and automated data mauling of time series and multivariate data streams. Where probabilistic programming systems outperform state-of-the-art machine learning systems on benchmarks that were not designed by the probabilistic programming community. So that's a pretty new development. The field has been incubating for and growing with successes in other areas, which I'll talk about in a minute, for a while. But it's sort of useful to reflect on sort of what's distinct about these application areas and what's common. And so, one of the themes you'll see in the tutorial today and tomorrow is sort of, I'll try to highlight sort of what are the common design idioms across these domains and the common programming abstractions that support them, as well as some of the key differences. Now, many of you, actually, can you raise your hand, people in the audience, if you've written a probabilistic program before? Okay, so some of you. So how many of you have heard of the Stan probabilistic programming language? Okay, so more of you. So probabilistic programming is maybe best known through its applications in science, and especially the Bayesian data analysis in science, Bayesian statistics. So, here on this slide, I'm just summarizing some of the applications of probabilistic programming outside of AI, which I mostly won't be talking about today, but it's useful to have that in the back of your mind for the tutorial. Significant success of the Stan community was the Ferguson forecasts, the Ferguson analyses of non-pharmaceutical interventions in the early phases of the COVID pandemic, looking differentially across Europe. They were all implemented in Stan. There have been a number of also very important applications of probabilistic programming in Stan and ecosystem informatics. Some very large scale applications in high energy physics, and some emerging applications in both experimental neuroscience and in climate modeling. So hopefully, between this slide, giving a range of applications of mostly Bayesian data analysis in science, and this slide, showing some AI applications, which we'll go into more in the tutorial, you have a sense of the scope of what's possible with the current generation of probabilistic programming languages. Now, it turns out that that range of capabilities can be boiled down to just a few key ideas, to really resting on just a few key ideas about programming. And so in some sense, these are the two, from my perspective, the two most important ideas to remember about probabilistic programming. The first is that what we're going to do is we're going to take probabilistic models, which might ordinarily be represented mathematically, and we're going to represent them as executable code using an abstraction called a generative program, which you'll see many examples of, where that generative code is going to make a random choice for every latent variable in the model. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to represent operations of inference and learning using metaprograms that operate on these generative programs, so take them as inputs or produce them as outputs. And from that, we're going to build up a set of capabilities that we're going to use to engineer the range of applications you just saw. Now, the field of probabilistic programming has been around for a while, and many different languages have been developed. I think it's useful to categorize them very broadly into languages here shown on the left, which aim for automatic inference. So Stan is maybe the highest profile instance of this, but there's also languages such as Anglican or Dice or Psi, or sometimes pronounced C, that all attempt to automate inference for restricted classes of probabilistic programs. And then there's languages with programmable inference, including Pyro and Gen, which allow the end user to customize inference using programming constructs, and which tend, as a result, to be able to target a broader range of applications. Now, it turns out that this idea of representing models as generative code that make random choices allows us to give a unifying representation of a diverse range of models from areas of AI and its applications. So that includes, graphical models in Bayesian networks, but also differentiable models, relational and logical models, open universe probabilistic models, such as tracking a set of objects whose size isn't known in advance, models involving scientific simulators, like COVID simulators or climate simulators, models of the contents of large relational databases, models based on real-time vision and graphics, and models in bioinformatics. This is not meant to be exhaustive. This is just kind of a representative set of applications, and I'm highlighting in yellow some of the ones that Faraz Saad was involved in, or played a leading role in, and I'm highlighting in cyan publications in these areas that were implemented using the Gen probabilistic programming language that you'll be learning in this tutorial and can access through the notebooks afterwards. Now, how does probabilistic programming actually automate operations for modeling and inference in terms of generative programs? So I'm going to talk a little more about this at a high level before we look at some concrete examples in much more technical detail. So at this point, probably many of us are familiar with, one of the central successes of modern deep learning and differentiable programming, which is sort of the application of automatic differentiation techniques, which have been around for decades, to large neural networks. So automatic differentiation lets us take a program that represents a function and either evaluate or sometimes statically compile and then specialize code for its gradients, its derivatives. And that's that's an example of automating a core idea from calculus using metaprogramming. Now, one idea that's added in probabilistic programming is the idea of taking code that makes random choices, so stochastic code that doesn't just define a deterministic function, and tracing those stochastic choices and calculating probability densities along that trace. And you'll see some examples of this both today and tomorrow. And that idea has been around in the probabilistic programming community for a long time, and it arises in many probabilistic programming languages. But to set the stage for today and tomorrow, I think it's important to recognize that really sort of digging into this idea of metaprogramming can take us a lot farther. It turns out that we can automate a broader range of operations from calculus and probability theory and also information theory as metaprograms that operate on generative probabilistic programs. And here I'm just showing some examples from recent publications from my lab. The problem of calculating Jacobian determinants, which will show up in many of the for reversible jump MCMC, which shows up in many of the examples you'll learn about today and tomorrow, that requires combining probabilistic and differentiable programming. Or versions of Bayes' rule that are exact for mixed distributions that combine continuous and discrete random variables. Or statically checking the absolute continuity of measures induced by probabilistic programs, or calculating or estimating radon-Nikodym derivatives, and also estimating Kullback-Leibler divergences and entropies and mutual informations. All these types of operations can be implemented, it turns out, as metaprograms. And that in turn lets us build higher level primitives for inference and learning that use this automated math. So we'll see examples in this tutorial of dynamic programming algorithms, sequential Monte Carlo algorithms, some generic MCMC, although more specialized MCMC, and a little bit of inference using deep neural networks to learn custom proposals. But the GEN platform supports all the methods that are shown on this slide. Okay. And so underneath all of this, as programming languages students, I imagine many of you are, we're going to be navigating some fundamental computational trade-offs in the design of intelligent systems. So one way of interpreting this slide is there's sort of maybe three desiderata in broad strokes. We want generality, we want automation, and we want functional metrics such as accuracy, efficiency, or reliability. And sort of the reality is we get to pick two. And so what you're going to be seeing over the course of today and tomorrow are how different probabilistic programming abstractions navigate design trade-offs amongst these metrics. And that mostly involves tools and programming languages, but really ultimately involves a whole stack of abstractions, not just abstractions for specifying generative models and performing inference, but for navigating specialization and generality trade-offs on top of those abstractions for domains like cognitive robotics and data-driven expert systems. And then underneath, having platforms with their own intermediate representations that strike an orthogonal set of trade-offs and interoperate with deep learning frameworks which struggle with the same trade-offs but for differentiable components. And then that in turn, that stack of probabilistic programming abstractions can be executed on both commodity hardware and further specialized using novel hardware abstractions, including FPGAs and novel spiking neural Monte Carlo circuits. So what I'm trying to do is just give you a sense that this view of probabilistic programming is really at the heart of a broader computing stack for engineering and reverse engineering intelligent systems. Okay. So let's look at the GEN probabilistic programming platform and spend the rest of today going in some depth into two example probabilistic programs, so you get a more tangible sense of what all that means. So GEN, you can access it at gen.dev. the notebook tutorials are linked from gen.dev, so I encourage you to check it out. Gen has been the basis of a number of papers and theses, and there's a small but growing package ecosystem and online documentation. And it's sort of at the stage now where there are a handful of users who we don't know who are writing papers using Gen, and a larger community at MIT whose research is really grounded in capabilities that Gen seems to distinctively unlock. So early days, sort of just transitioning out of basic research into applied research mainly. But you'll hear a little bit about sort of efforts to make production versions of Gen in the Open Gen section of the tutorial tomorrow. So the most important high-level idea in Gen is that in Gen, the user writes a generative program representing their model, but the user also writes an inference program. And this is in contrast to the model of probabilistic programming, where the user writes a model represented as a generative program and feeds that into a generic inference engine given some data to get results. And the basic reason is that it's very hard, we'll see later, for fundamental reasons. We might think it's impossible to build generic inference engines outside of restricted problem classes. And so this has been a big design challenge for the field in practice. In Gen, the inference programming flexibility allows the user to encode custom algorithms and also to exploit compilers for a range of embedded DSLs in Gen. You'll see a couple examples that produce fast, automatically specialized implementations of the model, and thereby together better approach the performance of handwritten inference code. And just to get a sense of sort of where Gen is in terms of performance, here I'm just showing a couple of the benchmarks from the 2019 PLDI paper on Gen for Bayesian linear regression and for nonlinear state space modeling on the bottom. So Bayesian linear regression on the top and nonlinear state space modeling on the bottom, where we're just showing the runtime of a range of inference algorithms implemented in different probabilistic programming systems. And the main takeaway is that although Gen is sufficiently general to capture these in many other applications, its performance is competitive with more specialized probabilistic programming systems on applications drawn from their intended domain. And I'll talk a little bit tomorrow about how what are the sort of programming language ideas that we used to achieve that particular balance of expressiveness and performance. And also how much room there still is to go to really compete with truly expert hand-optimized implementations, because there's, of course, a long way to go. Okay, so let's look at some probabilistic programs written in Gen. So we're going to start with the problem of learning a probabilistic program that can model a stream of data points coming in one at a time. So can you sketch in the air what structure you think is responsible for this data? Okay, so people are showing an oscillation, and then I saw somebody sort of showing that something rising. Okay, so let's learn how to write a probabilistic program that can do what you just did. So first, let me show you that it's possible. So here, I'm showing the data streaming in, overlaid with the forecasts in green of one learned probabilistic program whose source code is shown on the right here. And you can see as the data points come in, both the structure and parameters in the probabilistic program are evolving. And that's in turn affecting the structure of the forecasts. So let's just watch that again. Initially, there's broad uncertainty over the structure and the probable range of future data. But after a few cycles, the system starts to get a sense of the periodic structure, although it's not confident about how to extrapolate. But after a few more cycles, the system becomes fairly confident about not just the structure, but that it extrapolates over a longer range of time. Okay, so let's dive into this program in much more detail. Oh, and this is all work by Faraz Saad, principally by Faraz Saad. So there's three technical ideas that I'm going to go over to unpack this example. So the first idea is about modeling. We're going to see how to write a generative metaprogram for a generative DSL that provides exact inference. Then we're going to see how to do inference to learn to infer programs that are generated by that generative metaprogram. So this is a kind of program synthesis. And then we're going to see a little bit about how to scale this to databases, not just time series. So what's the class of probabilistic programs that we're learning from data? So here I'm showing one example on the right. And let's just walk through it piece by piece. So this program is a function that takes as input some time points t. And then from there, there's a variable DSL program, which specifies a time series structure. And I'll explain that more in just a minute. But that induces, that's used to induce this funny covariance matrix here labeled sigma. Then there's a noise level, which is a random choice, epsilon. And then there's some time series values x, which are calculated by unrolling a Gaussian distribution step by step, whose parameters are governed by previously sampled values and the covariance matrix sigma and the noise level epsilon. So this defines a big collection of Gaussian random variables for all the x's, as well as a gamma distributed random variable epsilon. And the covariance matrix for the Gaussian is determined by this DSL program, which I haven't fully explained yet. I'll do that in just a minute. So when we run this probabilistic program, we get simulated values of x, which I'm plotting here. This would be one typical realization from the probabilistic program. So each of these dots here might represent a single draw of one element of x at a time that corresponds to let's say so x sub I up here corresponds to the time point t sub I down below. What we're seeing in the bottom right is an execution trace of the probabilistic program, which is a data structure that'll come back again and again, where each element stores a value for a random choice that was made by executing the probabilistic program. And you can think of the probabilistic program as inducing a distribution over the structure and contents of all possible execution traces that are compatible with the structure of the code and the random calls that it makes. So if I run it again, maybe I get a different execution trace that yields different data. Here the noise is a little higher, so we see the points are more spread out. Or maybe I do it again and the noise is much, much lower, so the predicted x's are much more tightly constrained. If I do it 9 times, maybe I get a tile of executions like this. So hopefully this starts to give a little bit of a sense of the meaning of this sigma. It's basically determining how tightly coupled the values of the random variables x sub I and x sub j are across executions. Now, if I change the structure of this DSL program, I'll explain the little language for it in a minute, I can get time series with very different structures. So if I use one that says the time series has a periodic component, and that covariance function is multiplied with a covariance function that induces linear structure, then I get executions like the one shown on the left here, periodic signals overlaid with linear trends. But I can put in programs in the DSL that induce smooth functions with varying length scales, or change points. So this DSL program is saying that to the left of 0.5, the function's constant, and to the right, it's linear. So there's the problem of learning the structure of probabilistic programs is the problem of going from the data to sort of filling in the holes in this template with something that's compatible with this little grammar for DSL programs. It uses the primitives I showed below or showed before. So constants, linear, periodic kernels, squared exponential, and change points, and combinators for taking the sum and product of these covariance function kernels. And this idea is a long history in Gaussian process modeling. You can learn more about it from, for example, this kernel cookbook tutorial by Dave Duvenode, among other places. So what we saw then was somehow another inference in another probabilistic program filling in the holes in that probabilistic program template that I just showed you. Now, if we, and I'll say in a minute later, kind of, how to actually write the program that defines the model, and then how to do inference. But let's look at what you can do with it once you have it. So here I'm showing what happens when you quantify uncertainty about the underlying probabilistic program by looking across an ensemble of 64 programs. So you see, kind of much more graded shifts in the structure of the forecasts. And it turns out it's actually possible to implement this in Gen with accuracy that significantly exceeds the Facebook profit time series forecasting system, and also speed that's competitive. So probabilistic program structural learning on the right takes about 2 seconds. It's about the same runtime as Facebook profit on this data set. But the forecasts, I think, are significantly more sensible, both in terms of their structure and the way they account for uncertainty. This approach also compares favorably to neural profit, which was a more recently introduced neural network time series forecasting engine developed, I think, by some of the same people involved in the original profit system. Okay, so I'm going to skip change points. Actually, I won't. Let me do this. Now it turns out this data was showing airline passenger volume, which, as we know, crashed precipitously at the onset of the COVID pandemic. So an interesting feature of this probabilistic program is that it can detect and track that exogenous change. So what you're seeing here is inferences that are showing that once the passenger volume crashed, there's high probability of a change point, and forecasts of the future are to some degree independent of the past. And it turns out that the baseline time series forecasting systems really struggle to take into account of that structure. I won't go into the details of that comparison, but even when you tell them about change points, the estimation algorithm has trouble getting stable estimates of the location of the change points. Okay, so now how do we implement the probabilistic programming system that learns these probabilistic programs? So at a high level, what we're going to do is we're going to use a gen to write a probabilistic program that generates probabilistic programs. And this turns out to take just a couple hundred lines of gen code versus about 4,000 lines of code to do it's the closest reference system we could find that was implemented by hand by others. And the performance that we get is actually competitive with a hand-coded Julia baseline, which is what I'm showing on the bottom. So let's sort of dive in to how we implement this probabilistic program learning probabilistic program. So what you're seeing on the right is another version of the same basic code template we walked through before, but I'm highlighting that where this DSL program line is being filled in by a call to another generative program called generate random DSL program. And what you're seeing on the left are the values generated by that call and particular realizations of those time series. So the way we implement generate random DSL program is with a simple stochastic recursion. So that's a generative program, which at each invocation chooses a type of node, let's say constant or change point or linear or periodic, which are not shown, and then generates the parameters that are associated with that, like for a change point, the location of the change point drawn from a uniform distribution, and then it recurses to generate the DSL programs that will fill in the hole either to the left and the right of that randomly chosen change point. So this is a probabilistic program. This is a generative meta program for this little DSL that generates generative programs. And you can think of it conceptually as inducing a very broad ignorance prior of a very, very broad space of increasingly complex probabilistic programs as the abstract syntax tree depth increases. Now, how do we actually do inference in this model? Well, the basic template that we use, and you'll see that again and again in this tutorial, both today and in much more detail tomorrow, is resample move sequential Monte Carlo. So I'm showing a schematic of that inference process on the right, where you can see a collection of particles that are initialized, reweighted, and then with essentially weights that are local measures of the quality of those particles. Each particle corresponds to a trace of the target probabilistic program. Then a resampling step, which samples particles with probability proportional to the weight, so concentrates the particles on the probable ones. Then a move step, which applies stochastic updates, like from an MCMC algorithm, to perturb the particles and add more diversity, and then a reweighting step again. And this is cycled over and over again. And this idea goes back at least to Jilks and Berezini in 2001, although there have been a number of efforts to try to make probabilistic programming systems that make it easy to customize and extend this basic framework, which turns out to be quite general. And what I'm showing on the left is the high-level code for this type of resample move sequential Monte Carlo algorithm, which is on the right, where the first code block initializes all the particles, then steps through sort of adding in new data, resampling, applying MCMC updates, and then taking additional steps. And that basic iterative process, which again, we're going to go into much more detail when we talk about inference metaprogramming tomorrow, is the basic workhorse we're using for online structural learning of probabilistic programs. And it turns out to be much faster than MCMC. So here I'm showing, a typical trajectory of MCMC inference for this probabilistic program in black compared to resample move sequential Monte Carlo in red. But it turns out that it's pretty important that we're using all the degrees of freedom of this resample move SMC framework. So on the left here, I'm showing what the inference program that you saw earlier operating on the same data. And on the right, I'm showing a simpler inference program that just does particle filtering without any attempt to try to perturb the particles. And it turns out that that collapses to underfit probabilistic programs. So let's look at how we actually did the perturbations. So the conceptual problem we have to solve is to go from a program to a new program by making a proposal that's going to regenerate part of the randomly generated abstract syntax tree. So we have to find a part of the abstract syntax tree to regenerate it, and then accept or reject that change. And there's other moves we might try to do, like stitch or regraft parts of the abstract syntax tree in new places. So a range of these types of edits to abstract syntax trees that are possible. But in Gen, one way we can implement these types of edits is by writing generative functions that encode probabilistic models for these proposal processes. So here I'm showing a generative function which makes a subtree proposal by walking down the tree that's fed in as input and then calling the prior to generate a new subexpression at some depth. And then once that's been done, that's fed into an operation called an involution, which basically stitches that new proposed subtree into the abstract syntax tree of the trace and correctly calculates, and then from that, Gen has to derive the math to calculate the acceptance ratio. The math is shown in the top right here, to correctly accept or reject that change to have a valid MCMC update to the trace. And again, for people here who haven't heard of MCMC or probabilistic inference, you'll see some of these concepts built up a little bit more granularly tomorrow, but I'm just trying to give you a flavor for the scope for the kinds of computations you can express with a probabilistic programming system today. Now, this basic template of learning the structure of probabilistic programs from data by doing inference in a setup where you have a generative metaprogram lets us implement techniques for analyzing many different types of structured data, including time series data, panel data, cross-sectional data, and relational data. And once we have probabilistic programs, especially if they're in DSLs which are tractable for symbolic inference, so for example, the DSL I showed, the probabilistic programs encode a Gaussian distribution, so it's possible to exactly calculate probabilities analytically. There's other examples, and there are other DSLs where exact inference is also possible. But sort of in those settings, one can implement a picture where one goes from data to learn the structure of probabilistic programs, where one then can answer a broad range of queries by performing symbolic inference to make forecasts, find anomalies, extract independencies, compute the probabilities of rare events, simulate rare events, or generate synthetic data. And so I think it's useful to just get a brief flavor of the synthetic data example using in the setting of multivariate databases. So here I'm showing inference QL, another probabilistic programming system, where the input data is not a time series, but a stream of records from a database table. So I'm showing that stream on the right, and I'm showing a view of the aggregated structure of the learned probabilistic programs in a different DSL on the left. And once we've learned these probabilistic programs in inference QL, we can do things like query them to generate accurate synthetic data. So here I'm showing synthetic data in orange next to real observed data in black for inference QL on the left, compared to copula modeling in the middle here, and the CTGAN neural network system on the right from an open source system called the Synthetic Data Vault, which is a strong baseline that's also being used commercially. So this is trying to give you a feeling that it's possible to learn probabilistic program structures from diverse types of data. And these probabilistic programs can be used to answer lots of interesting types of queries. So for example, on this database, which happens to be a database of satellites, one interesting question is, what are the probable data errors? So for example, I might be interested in knowing what satellites in geostationary orbit have unlikely orbital periods. And you can pose that in inference QL with a query shown here, where you are combining ordinary SQL operations like SQL select with operations that calculate conditional probabilities under the probabilistic programs that were learned using the techniques that you just saw. And that turns out to pop out rows that have data entry errors that we're able to verify using domain knowledge. So what this example is really trying to point to is that probabilistic programming allows us, at least in principle, to not just write probabilistic programs encoding domain knowledge, but also to learn models for generic structured data sources. So I want to close this section of the tutorial or this example with just a question. It'll come back again at the end of tomorrow. But what if we imagined every database being equipped with a probabilistic program that modeled it? We've had some success building models of clinical trial databases, high throughput experiments in systems biology, survey data, such as the Stack Overflow Software Developer Survey, demographic data from the US Census, using the same basic structural learning techniques for probabilistic programs that you saw. So later tomorrow, we'll return to this example to try to get a sense of sort of how probabilistic programming might be able to scale across a broader range of use cases and what are the computer science problems that need to be solved to do that. Okay, so I'd like to spend the last, I think probably, I guess I have about 15, maybe 20 minutes. Is that right, Swarat? Because we started a little bit late. I can push some stuff to tomorrow. Oh, 15 minutes?
Yeah, 15.
Great. So let's look at an example from a very different domain, real-time inference of 3D scenes from video. So the capability we're going to build up to is going from input images and RGB and depth shown on the left here to 3D models that can be used to reconstruct a clean underlying depth image in terms of object models and a scene graph characterizing the contact relationships between those objects. So here, the structure that we're inferring and quantifying the uncertainty of are approximate voxel-based models of depth data, as opposed to the structure of source code for modeling time series. And it turns out that it's possible to do this in such a way that using Gen that achieves maybe a little bit slower than real time, so 2x slower than real time performance, but significantly higher accuracy and robustness than the dense fusion deep learning system, which is shown on the top of the slide here. And the 3DP3 system on the bottom, its inferences about object pose are much less prone to reflect large errors that violate common sense assumptions. So for example, on the top left here, we can see this bottle in cyan is sort of floating in space, which is maybe not impossible if there was something supporting it that we just couldn't see, but maybe unlikely. But it's existing in places where there's clearly no stuff. So that's an example of a violation of common sense. And it turns out that this can be done more accurately than dense fusion, assessed across thousands of real-world scenes from the Yale CMU Berkeley database of the YCB database of tabletop scenes. So I'm just going to build up in 2 stages to showing you sort of the key components of how that probabilistic program. So the first part, just to get a sense of, is how do we do inverse graphics with probabilistic programming at all? So here's just a variant of that probabilistic program that's running on a stream of video. So maybe a little bit more analogous to the time series structural learning example you saw earlier. So the left movie is showing a real-time depth video stream from a depth camera. The right is showing a real-time inferences about a segmentation of the video, where pixels in blue are pixels the system knows it can explain well. Pixels in red and black are inferred artifacts, and pixels in yellow are pixels that the system knows that it can't explain. And in the middle, I'm showing a very low resolution simplified 3D model that just has a floor, a ceiling, and and a camera, some height and orientation that's being used to interpret the data on the left. So the blue pixels are basically the ones that kind of fit the floor and the ceiling based on the inferred camera pose. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a few stages of the generative model and the inference process that we use to do this. And at the end of the day, we're going to have a simple generative program, which, much like the time series example, when you run it, it generates virtual worlds and synthetic data. And then an inference program, which explores that space of traces, each corresponding to a virtual world, and to find the probable ones. So let's walk through the generative program for this example. So here we have a function, and this time it takes no arguments. It starts by defining a floor plane, so there's a sort of coordinate system that's set up, and I'm showing a visualization in the top right and a record of its trace in the bottom right. There have been no random choices so far, so the trace is empty. Okay, so now the first random choice we're going to generate is the height of the camera. Once we've generated that, we're going to generate a pitch and roll for the camera. So these are all generated from uniform distributions. So we can see the trace growing with those random choices and a schematic representation of the new latent scene, the world that this generative program describes. After we've located the camera within the scene, we're going to render that scene to produce a depth image, which I'm showing on the bottom left here. So the camera pointed in this funny angle, maybe we get sort of a little piece of the floor. And then finally, we're going to add some sensor noise from an outlier model. So, some of the pixels are going to be close to what the model thinks is likely, and some of the pixels are going to be very different. And that's basically going to allow us to account for the gap between these very simplified, clean images and the very messy real data that we're going to be asked to interpret. So that's the basic skeleton of the generative program. How do we do inference? Well, the inference program is going to first grab a frame from the depth camera. So here I'm showing it grabbing a frame, in this case, just a synthetic example so that it's easier to understand. And then we're going to generate an initial trace. So we're asking Gen to take the generative model we saw and the constraints, which are that the observation, the observed depth image matches the frame that we loaded from the depth camera. And we're going to make a trace that encodes that constraint, and that data flow is passed in by the constraints variable shown here. And then we're going to start doing MCMC inference. So for, let's say, 1,000 steps, we're going to start making Metropolis Hastings proposals that are going to perturb different random choices in the trace according to various proposal distributions that either regenerate them according to the underlying generative program or make small random walk perturbations. The details of that aren't super important, but the process that generates something like what I'm showing here. So we can watch that again in just a minute. It initializes to some random location and then wiggles around, settling into something that is maybe a reasonable match to, in this case, just the floor plane in the observed image. And then once we exit the loop, we're going to return the final trace. So I think in the time that remains today, I'm just going to walk through a couple improvements to the model to build back up to a sequential Monte Carlo algorithm like the one that we saw last time. And I'm going to save 3DP3 for tomorrow. So this model only has the floor. So let's extend it to model the ceiling as well. So one way we can do that is we can take our generative program and we can just add a few lines that make a new random choice where the room height is now going to be drawn from a uniform distribution, let's say between 2.5 and 3. So higher than likely to be higher than the floor. And we're going to generate the ceiling at that height. And that's going to extend the list of objects, which is going to get passed into the depth renderer. So now we're generating worlds that look a little bit more like the real data. And if we do that, we also have to extend the inference program to make perturbations to the room height on each step, and occasionally to regenerate it from its prior. And that produces an inference process, which looks something like this. So now we can see the initial trace, the basic dynamics starting from a random scene and adjusting to fit the data are the same, but the scenes now have a floor and a ceiling. Now it's worth, to get an intuition for this programming model, it's helpful to just play with the inference program a little bit. And the online tutorials give lots of opportunities for doing that on some simple Gen examples. But one thing we can do is we can take that inference program and we can make it online. So we can make it a sequential Monte Carlo algorithm where instead of having a for loop that runs 1,000 steps, we're going to have a while loop that pulls from the depth camera within the loop and clobbers the trace using this update method, which Gen provides, which I'm going to explain as part of the inference metaprogramming section tomorrow. In between one sweep of making little Metropolis Hastings updates to the random variables. So now this while loop is adjusting the scene, getting new data, updating the trace, and repeating. And that produces something that can track changing data from a video stream online. And so that's what I'm showing here. And you can also visualize the traces quantitatively. I won't go into the details, but I will highlight one feature of this inference program that's maybe useful and will help you build a little bit of intuition. So if I remove this first line, which regenerates all the latent variables, the camera pitch and roll, the camera height, and the room height, so I'm only making local perturbations, then it turns out that the system can easily get stuck in local minima and sometimes sort of fails to converge. If, on the other hand, I remove all the local perturbations and I only make big changes that regenerate the trace, what you see is these very blocky changes. It's actually hard to track the small changes from frame to frame. So the combination of robust convergence and efficient online tracking really required both of the types of MCMC moves. The last thing I'll say about the inference program, which you'll learn more about tomorrow, and you'll also learn how some of these primitives are implemented in Gen and how a little bit about how they're automated, is it turns out Gen allows users to automate the training of neural nets using synthetic traces from the underlying probabilistic program. And I think actually just in the interest of time, really all I'll say about that for today is that if you use that neural network to do inference on its own, so if you train a neural net on lots of synthetic traces from the Gen program, you get a model that works in the narrow range that the network was trained for. But if you show it data that's very unlikely, like the camera pointed at the ceiling or pointed at the floor, then maybe unsurprisingly the neural net fails. But if that neural net is instead just used as a custom proposal for a Metropolis Hastings update, or other types of sequential Monte Carlo updates in this case, then the whole system can track the camera pose accurately, even when the camera is in extreme regimes that go out of the range that the neural net was trained in, because the Monte Carlo algorithm can remain robust in that setting. Okay, so tomorrow, we'll start by finishing this section and looking at how to scale up to tabletop scenes. And then we'll spend the rest of the day opening the hood of Gen. So trying to explain, how is MH implemented? What's really going on in SMC? What are the limits of automating and scaling this type of inference? What do we know about what those limits might be from theory and from engineering efforts as well? And what does the systems and AI research roadmap look like over the next couple years? Okay, I'm happy to take some questions if there are any.
Questions?
And I'd like to ask people who want to ask questions, if you feel comfortable it'd be great if you could just sort of come up so I can hear you directly rather than having to have them. But if people are more comfortable, maybe raise their hand and someone can call on them and repeat the question since I can't hear you.
Let's first try the mic, and then if it doesn't work.
Oh, great. Yeah, the mic seems to be working now.
Okay, great. Hey, thanks so much. You mentioned that it might be sort of theoretically fundamentally impossible to automate the inference. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, actually, I'll just refer you to tomorrow. We're going to cover sort of the limits from computability and known results and complexity on that, and also the considerable room there is for the unreasonable effectiveness of both deep learning and Monte Carlo to exist. That's it. So, yeah, I mean, so maybe the short answer is that there are exact posterior inference is uncomputable in general, but surprisingly computable for an enormously broad range of cases that includes arguably all the needs of AI and data science and robotics. I'll explain what I mean by that. And then also, but from a complexity theoretic perspective, exact inference seems, is tractable only under very severe restrictions that still make it a very useful building block. but there's actually considerable room for approximate sampling, especially to be tractable, even for non-convex problems, maybe especially it turns out for non-convex problems, including some known results that show that sampling can be provably more efficient than optimization. I'll talk about that tomorrow a little bit.
Hi, Vikash. Thanks for a great talk. I just wanted to ask, it seems to me that one of these sort of fundamental problems with applying probabilistic programming in practice is actually coming up with these generative models. It seems like in more sort of conceptually complex AI tasks, constructing a generative model of how your world behaves isn't actually that simple. Is this intuition correct, or is that actually not a problem in practice? If it is a problem in practice, have you considered, like, is there a world in which you could do some sort of synthesis to automatically derive the generative model, or, you know, what are sort of the, is that a problem in practice, or is it not?
Yeah, so it's definitely crucial for AI applications. You're absolutely right to learn from data, sort of, in some sense, I'd say, maybe not quite as much as one can, but to use learning aggressively. You'll see examples tomorrow of how that's done in 3DP3. So what components are hand engineered and what components are learned. In the structural learning example, right, that is an example where the probabilistic program we write is a prior on probabilistic programs. So we're learning probabilistic programs from data, but we're learning them from a DSL that strikes a specific design trade-off between expressiveness and tractability. So of course, maybe I would say, I think there are lots of fundamental challenges in understanding how to scale that up to more general forms of open-ended cognition and learning. But I also think there's an approach, which is not to either try to learn completely from scratch or to hand engineer, but instead to write down probabilistic programs that encode very broad ignorance priors over expressive languages of models, and to use inference to try to infer in a Bayesian way, or do kind of Bayesian synthesis, as you saw from Faras's work, what the probabilistic programs are.
Hi, Vikash. Thanks for your talk. So this inference engine using Gen, could you explain some connection to how that may be helpful for program synthesis direction as well? And also how you're modeling the generative models, is that compatible with specifying constraints? How that could be done?
Just to check, by program synthesis, do you mean synthesis of deterministic, let's say, functions, just as a simple class? I mean, or a very broad class, but.
Actually, both. I'd love to hear your thoughts on both directions. So one is deterministic one, and the other one is probabilistic one.
Yeah. So so I'd say I've thought much more about using probabilistic programs to synthesize or learn the structure of probabilistic programs. Although, I think many of the other people here in this tutorial may have thought much more about using various kinds of AI techniques for synthesizing deterministic programs. So I'll really maybe I'll focus on learning probabilistic programs. I'll just say one thing about deterministic programs, which is, so I think sort of the fundamental design challenge for scaling up structural learning or Bayesian synthesis of probabilistic programs is how to co-design the DSL with the inference program, such that there's a good trade-off between generality, expressiveness, and performance, and that's very challenging. But what Gen allows us to do so far has been to explore architectures that use much richer inference algorithms, like these resample move SMC algorithms, in conjunction with pretty expressive, recursive priors for probabilistic programs, and to experiment with those kind of analogously to how a platform like PyTorch lets us experiment with neural net architectures and automate the, calculation of gradients that are needed for SGD, for large scale parameter estimation. So, Gen kind of is basically giving us the experimental platform to do that co-design without being completely bottlenecked by deriving and implementing inference algorithms in each case. And there's an enormously broad, indeed much broader space of models for that type of synthesis that I think would be useful. And hopefully after you've seen more about inference meta programming tomorrow, maybe, we can talk a little bit more about specific directions that I think might be on the edge of tractability. Maybe I'll just say one thing about deterministic program synthesis. And this now is, since it's not a field that I've really worked in, recognize that what I'm saying is maybe quite speculative or ambitious, but I'll say for my part, I'm very interested in the question of how to use probabilistic programming tools to build deeper models of the semantics of programs that are being synthesized, whether they're probabilistic or deterministic. So, when I, as a programmer, I'm programming, there's many layers of modeling I can access intuitively about the likely behavior of the program, not just what it will compute, but how it will compute it at varying levels of detail and how fast it'll compute it. And indeed how that behavior would likely change as a result of specific changes to the program. So I'm very interested in the research direction of more cognitive approaches to probabilistic program synthesis, or to program synthesis in general, including deterministic programs as well as probabilistic programs that use probabilistic programming to model the knowledge and the inferences, at least some of the knowledge and inferences that programmers actually use. But that's a very challenging direction, but I think in the long run, if we can figure out how to do that, I think it's likely that it would work reasonably well. It's just very hard.
Great, thank you. How about we thank Vikash?
We're running a little bit late on the schedule, so right now we have a break, but I would suggest we keep the break short, maybe 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And then we'll meet back here for the last presentation of the day.